Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to take a look at question 8, article 1, where Aquinas gets into the object of the will. What is it that we will when we will things? And his answer to that is that we will the good. We will goods and only goods. So how does that work? Especially since the most obvious question is, well, what about evils? Do people will evils at all? And that question is looming in the background for all the objections. It's what the objections are actually aiming at. It's going to be what Aquinas has to address in the reply. We're not yet ready to talk about moral good and evil yet. That comes in a later question, but this is the first step toward doing that. And if we could end up in a really bad dead end if we end up claiming that no one ever wills evils. That would be a very strange ethics and not one that will work for Aquinas or the Catholic tradition. In the course of the article, we're going to spend a lot of time comparing the voluntas to other powers. That's the main approach of the objectors. And Aquinas will, of course, need to distinguish the voluntas from other powers. We're also going to take a look at the role of the intellect. How is it that objects are proposed to the will? We need to spend a lot of time over the next several questions looking at what's going on with the intellect and the will and how we go about reasoning toward our ends. And finally, this article is dominated by the return of a very famous medieval doctrine, something that I teach my ninth grade students at the beginning of their studies with me when they first come to St. Anselm's, and that is the convertibility of transcendentals, or the convertibility of being and goodness. And if you remember that, and we'll go over it in this video, and you understood question 6, especially article 1, then article 1 of question 8 is pretty easy. The first two objections are pretty similar, and we could really roll them together, although we'll treat both of them at least briefly. They're both talking about the voluntas compared to powers. We especially care about the reply to the first one. There's something of substance in that reply we need to look at. The third objection is the funny one, and also the important one. This is where the convertibility of transcendentals comes up, and the funny part is that you could really think of this as a student attempting to deploy one of Aquinas' favorite ideas against him. And that's why you're going to see it again in the sed contra and why the respondeo is going to rely so heavily on it. And we'll be spending a lot of time with the convertibility of being and goodness over the next several videos. So objection 1, it would seem that the will is not of good only, for the same power regards opposites. For instance, sight regards white and black. Good and evil are opposites, therefore the will is not only of good, but also of evil. Simple enough. The hidden premise here is that the voluntas is a power. We have said that in previous videos. And powers regard opposites. Aquinas is a little ambiguous here, a little vague, I think, about what kind of powers he's talking about. In Aristotle's metaphysics, which Aquinas is going to rely on a bit throughout this article, there are definitely powers that don't regard opposites. Aristotle calls those the irrational powers. Aquinas would probably just call them natural powers. So possibly Aquinas has in mind powers of the soul here, sense powers, perhaps. And since he gives the example of sight, that seems like a good guess. I actually think his sight example is slightly unclear just because we would need to get into his ideas of the sensible and the role of light and color, and things like that. Hearing might have a more intuitive appeal for us. Hearing regards both sound and silence, and you can think about that in more than one way, right? When everything suddenly goes quiet, when the lawnmower and the leaf blower outside of my door suddenly cut off, I can hear that, even though it's an absence, it's a nothing that you're hearing. It's also the case that just for communication, the way we speak to each other depends not only on the sounds we make, but on the spaces between the sounds. In order for there to be signal, there has to be empty space in some way. That might be one way to think about the way powers regard opposites. At any rate, since V, or the voluntas, is a power, powers regard opposites, well then if the voluntas regards goods, it must regard the opposite as well. And the opposite of good is evil. Therefore, it must regard evil. Objection 2 is going to do the same thing, but now we want to talk specifically about rational powers. And again, we see the Metaphysics Book 9 reference. Here he's explicit about it. Rational powers can be directed to opposite purposes, according to the philosopher. But the will is a rational power, since it is in the reason, as stated in De Anima 3:9. Therefore, the will can be directed to opposites, and consequently its volition is not confined to good, but extends to evil. I leave the citations in there for two different reasons. The metaphysics one, because I've just referenced it, and we're going to talk about it a little bit throughout this video. It's important for the whole article. And the De Anima, because that's a very controversial section of the De Anima, and the way Aristotle talks about the will there is sort of famously problematic. They're both very famous citations, and I thought it might be worthwhile leaving them in there. I would say that for our purposes, we have the same idea here as in objection 1. We might want to get a little bit into what Aristotle is talking about in Metaphysics Book 9, where he contrasts heat as an irrational power with medical science, or the art of medicine, which is a power of the intellect, also can be a habit of the intellect, but a power of the intellect for producing something, in this case, health in another. And as he claims there, medicine, because it's a rational power, an operation of the intellect, can produce opposites. It not only regards health, but also disease. It can produce both. I don't think it helps us if we try to go too far down the rabbit hole with what Aristotle is going for in Metaphysics Book 9, although it might be interesting. Instead, maybe we should try to think about the way intellect regards true and false. And that's actually going to be very much the same way the will regards good and evil. Or also the way that when we plan, when we deliberate, when we're figuring things out, we can devise truly opposite plans. Maybe those are things to think about here. But otherwise, I don't think for the purposes of the article, it matters too much. We just want to be able to say that powers regard opposites. Now here's the good one. Here's the funny one. Further, good and being are convertible. But volition is directed not only to beings, but also to non-beings. For sometimes we wish not to walk or not to speak. And again at times we wish for future things, which are not actual beings. Therefore the will is not of good only. So in a minute we're going to do a review slide on the convertibility thesis, but take it for granted for a minute that being and good are convertible. What that means is anytime we find the word being, we can sub in the word good instead. We can substitute. And that means we can actually play the same kind of negation game we played back in question 6, article 3, with quite similar results, actually. A different problem, though. So if the voluntas wants things, if it wills beings, then that means the voluntas wills goods. And surely we want things. But we did establish in question 6, article 3, that the voluntas also wills non-beings. And since we can sub in good for being, that means the voluntas wills non-goods or evils. Some examples, the examples that the objector gives for non-beings, well, the will, we can will negations, not to do this, not to do that. That's what Aquinas says here. But also something we haven't seen before, future things that don't exist yet. They're not actual. And that's Aquinas weighing in a little bit on some contemporary disputes about theories of time, A and B and such. Now, the move from good to evil, like good and non-good, that's actually legit. That was a mistake the way he was negating things back in question 6, article 3. But here the objector is negating things just fine. So there's going to be a different kind of problem here. But the obvious result is that we will evils. So all of the objectors are agreed in this. Now, before we move on, I think we do need a review slide on the transcendentals. It's a little bit hard to know how much to say here. The convertibility of transcendentals, or the transcendentals of being, is probably the most famous of all the medieval contributions to philosophy. It's an expansion, a very big expansion, on an idea found in Aristotle. And the idea in Aristotle is seen down here in the bottom right quotation, which is also from earlier in the Summa. Aristotle did demonstrate that being and good are in some way one. They're the same thing. In Aquinas' language, good and being are really the same and differ only in idea. Good names the aspect of desirable, which being does not. My students first encounter this in 9th grade. We use it a lot. Very early in Form 3, when we're doing our natural theology at the beginning of the year, we take a look at how to demonstrate that the first mover, pure act, as we've just resolved in some earlier weeks, is also good. So we start deriving other features or attributes of pure act. And the first one we look at is simplicity, because all forms of composition imply potency in some way, and pure act doesn't have any potencies, therefore it is simple. And then we look at the way in which pure act is perfect. And perfect there doesn't mean maximally good. or at least not in its simple sense. In its simple sense, it just means finished or completed. And that means that its potencies have been actualized. And so one of the divine attributes is that God, as pure act, is also purely perfect. He doesn't have any potencies to be actualized. It's not that he ever did. He's perfect without being perfected, might be one way to say it. But after you do that, you want to show that God is good. And what I have here is a very simple, kind of stupid visual sketch of how Aquinas shows that at the beginning of the Summa. You begin with this basic idea that the good is what all desire, or that the basic signification of good is that it is wanted or wantable. And you should recognize in that language, just question 6, article 1. We've actually already been talking about it in this video series from the moment we started doing ethics. The heavy lifting claim, or maybe the difficult claim in the proof, is that things are desired insofar as they are perfect, because all things desire their own perfection. Aquinas doesn't elaborate too much when my students learn this. We just give them the basic version. But the idea is that the desires that things have, or the appetites that things have, or the inclinations that things have, are toward the things that will perfect them, that complete them, that finish them. And this is true not just of humans or even of animals, but of everything. And you're going to see some of the language of that in this article. That we can talk about appetite in the way he means it here of anything, the way electrons seek a low energy state. Anyway, if you can get past that somewhat more difficult step, then the rest follows pretty easily. If a thing is desirable or desired insofar as it is perfect, well, it's definitely perfect insofar as it is actual. That's not hard to show, because the degree of perfection is equal to the degree of actuality of a thing. And if you just want to show that God is good, or that pure act is good, the first mover is good, that's enough. You can stop there. You can break off the proof, because you've linked good to actual. But if you want to demonstrate the convertibility of being and goodness, you take one more step, which we're now going to use in ethics, and that is that a thing is actual insofar as it exists, because it's being or existence that makes all things actual. And with that, you've got in hand the basic idea that when you say something is good, you are really just, again, saying that it's being, but with this added idea of desired, and the claim that this is true of all being. Being as such is desirable. The medieval theory of transcendentals is that you can actually do this with things other than just good. That while you can use this, and we do use it, to ground the privation theory of evil, that evil is just the lack of a do-good, it's sort of the opposite of this whole thing. You can also see these trans-categorical claims about being, as we say on the top right, some predicates may be said to add to being inasmuch as they express a mode of being, not expressed by the term being. It's a tough language and it's a tough idea. And we don't really need to get into the full theory of the transcendentals. But it is worth knowing that good is not the only one. The general form is being as X in this hyphenated form over here on the left. So being as desired is the transcendental of good. Being as known or knowable, intelligible, fitting for the intellect, that's the transcendental of true. And the others get much more technical for our purposes. As it turns out, true and good are the easier ones, I think, to talk about. So that's the refresher course. Perhaps we can go create a video that gets more into the argument later. We will return to this idea repeatedly, because I think for Aquinas, this is what grounds our ability to move from physics, which is the study of mobile being, to ethics. This link of being and goodness is why his approach to ethics works. It's what drives it. Now, back to the article. The said contra is funny because it looks at for a moment like he's just giving the answer, nuh-uh. But in reality, he's directly coming back at Objector 3. Objector 3 said, I don't think you've taken account of the convertibility of transcendentals here, sir. And Aquinas says, yes, let's look at that argument. In fact, let's go look at the very first line of that argument. What does it say? All things desire good, or the good is what all desire. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with this idea of appetite. The respondeo is in two parts. The first part is the convertibility of transcendentals. And the second part is extremely important, and for some reason my students skip over it every year. If you don't move on to the second paragraph, or the second paragraph as the English translator gives it, then you get a terrible answer. So the first thing we're going to say here is that the will is not just a power, it's a rational appetite, a particular kind of power. And an appetite is only of something good. We're just filling out some of the claims that we're making in the convertibility argument. The reason of this is that an appetite is nothing else than, and now I have to trash this translation because it's terrible, an inclination of a person desirous of a thing toward that thing. Come back to that. Now, every inclination is to something like and suitable to the thing inclined. Since, therefore, everything, inasmuch as it is being and substance, is a good, it must needs be that every inclination is to something good. And hence it is that the philosopher says, the good is what all desire. So, I've provided the snippet of Latin here because translating is hard. But using the word person here, it's not just that it doesn't stick close to the Latin, it's that it directly contradicts the account of appetite that Aquinas gives in this respondeo. So there's nothing in the Latin about person. It's inclinatio appetentis in aliquid, an inclination of a desiring or desirer to something. That's it. It has nothing to do with humans. If humans didn't exist, this would still be true and important. And we're going to get to that in the next slide. It's a dreadful translation. I don't know what possessed them to use person here, other than it's a little bit difficult to figure out a way to render it. But you can't possibly only be talking about persons, because again, we actually want to be able to talk about electrons as serving the role of the appetentis, or of dogs, or of flowers, or water as it spills on the table and spreads out. Everything works this way. It's a very strange translation. But the key here is that we just have the convertibility argument. The conclusion of the convertibility argument is that being and good are convertible. Well, when we have appetite, we have appetite of things. He does fill out the idea of like and suitable and desire. It does help us talk through the convertibility thesis, but he's not actually trying to reprove the convertibility argument here. He actually just needs to say, when we have an appetite, it's for things. And things, as we know from the convertibility argument, are good. He just gives the conclusion right there. And so appetite must be of good. Done. Very easy. Very simple. However, what about evil? Indeed, perhaps we should keep reading. Here's the answer. And the first line here is difficult, but it is also why that translation on the previous slide is dreadful. It must be noted that, since every inclination results from a form, the natural appetite results from a form existing in the nature of things, while the sensitive appetite, as also the intellective or rational appetite, which we call the will, follows from an apprehended form. Therefore, just as the natural appetite tends to a good existing in a thing, so the animal or voluntary appetite tends to a good which is apprehended. So he's giving an interesting taxonomy here. And at first glance, if you don't look carefully, if you see rational, sensitive, and natural, it's tempting to try to make this tripartite division line up with Aristotle's three souls, the three kinds of living things, rational, animal, and vegetal. It's actually not what's going on here. Instead, every inclination to something either arises from a thing's own form, from its own nature, or from a form that it has apprehended. Most things, non-rationals, non-sensitive, non-living things, and vegetables too, apparently, they have this natural appetite. It's a strange use of the word appetite, obviously, but we're not just talking about animals being hungry for food. We mean the way electrons seek their low energy state, or plants set down roots seeking water, or inclined toward the sun, things like that. And that just arises from their very nature, from their own form, from the kind of thing that they are, and the forms of the things around them. But as living things, as sensitive living things, so animals and rational animals, we apprehend forms of things around us, and those forms which begin to exist within us when we apprehend them, those are the things that we move to with the animal appetite, the sense appetite, or the rational appetite. Now, you can make a Porphyrian tree out of this relatively easily. I got tired of making Porphyrian trees. You can make your own as your student exercise. But this is the crucial distinction. Our rational appetite follows upon our rational knowledge. because objects are proposed to it, it's the object that exists in the intellect or in the senses and then through the intellect that moves the will. It's not the object as it exists in itself. Consequently, in order that the will tends to anything, it is requisite not that it be good in very truth, in re, but that it be apprehended as good, that it be considered good in intellectu, in the mind, in the intellect. Wherefore the philosopher says, and if you remember nothing else, you just have to remember the last line here, the end is a good or an apparent good. We will use this over and over again for the rest of this series. This is how you begin to talk about how we will evils. You should recognize in this, we will evils as apparent goods. Now, it is more complicated than that. It's not just as simple as, well, I thought it was good, sorry. We can recognize things from different aspects. We can see parts of things. We can see it in one way and not in another. We can miss things. So I could say, well, I see a good in it. I can even be aware that it's also bad, right? I know it's bad for me and it will make my parents angry, but it'll be fun. I know God forbids it, but it'll feel good. And it's always, when we're willing things, it's for the sake of the yeah, but that we actually will it. It's the good that we find in it. We might be wrong about the good, and we might be right about the good. Could go either way. And that picture we will round out as we go through the next several questions of the Summa. Now all that's left is to clean up the objections, actually. The answer is pretty simple. We will goods, but only as they exist in the intellect, and therefore we can make mistakes, and that's how we can will evils. And we can make mistakes in lots of ways. But we do have some cleanup issues. One of the funny things about the structure or the formatting of this article is that it's objection 2 that brings up Metaphysics Book 9, but he actually uses Metaphysics Book 9, or the idea of it, in his reply to objection 1. So there's a way in which the article is sort of, or the text of Metaphysics 9 is in the background of all of this. So the answer here is pretty important, I think, for 2 reasons. The same power regards opposites, but it is not referred to them in the same way. Accordingly, the will is referred both to good and to evil, but to good by desiring it, to evil by shunning it. And I'm going to skip over this section in the middle, actually. I want to pause there before I get to that. So, hearing, the proper object of hearing is sound, but there is some way in which silence or negation plays some role in it. But it would be weird to say that silence is its proper object. And it doesn't have 2 proper objects. It does have 1. Here, what Aristotle was getting at with in metaphysics was the idea of medicine as properly producing health, but there's also a way in which it's avoiding disease, and therefore it knows about disease, and therefore it knows how to cause it as well. But that's not what it means to be a doctor. Causing disease, being a poisoner, being an assassin doesn't make you a doctor. Here, it's a little different than both of those, I think. What you have to see is that we will things as goods and we avoid them as evils, or we anti-will them. You could talk about this in more than one way, I think. And this is probably the kind of thing we should argue about a little bit in class. Well, this is a good dialectical moment. But the proper object of the will is the good, but we also shun evils. And Aquinas ends up with this funny neologism for trying to express the shunning of evil. However, to see what it is, we have to do this weird terminological problem. The editor of this translation has added in brackets, which I've bolded here, this claim that Aquinas, when he talks about the will and when it wills, he actually uses the same noun. He uses the same word, the voluntas. Voluntas for him names both the power of willing as well as its proper act, the operation that it does. We do this in English with the word sense, or we can do it in English with the word sense. We have a sense power, and when we use that sense power, we are sensing. So an animal senses with sense. That's a little bit cumbersome, but we can sort of live with it and talk around it and use extra words if we want to tell them apart. By contrast, we don't do that with the intellect. We don't like to say that the intellect intellects, so we say that the intellect understands. Although Latin actually does just say the intellect intellects. And Aquinas does say that the voluntas, its act is voluntas. However, fairly soon, we decided that that was a bad idea, that it just takes too much effort to try to talk around voluntas as a power and voluntas as the operation of that power, its proper act. And so we coined the term volition, which is just another word derived from volo, to want. And volition comes to mean the proper act of the will in our later tradition. And what's a little bit interesting and potentially confusing from time to time is that when you're reading Aquinas, English translators will often use volition, where Aquinas is just talking about the voluntas in act. And Aquinas will occasionally ask questions or dive into things that don't make a lot of sense if you're actually if you're distinguishing the terms. And that's what the translator is warning you about right here. We're going to see it again, and we're going to need to get familiar with this terminology. You need to be comfortable both with Aquinas' own method, the voluntas as a power and the voluntas in act, and with this terminology of voluntas and volition. We will see both. That brings us to the thing at the bottom, where we have the funny word nolition, because nolo is how you negate volo in Latin. But since Aquinas doesn't have volition, he has voluntas, Aquinas has the actual Latin monster, noluntas, which I'm not sure who invented it, but it's a dreadful word. And we will use volition mostly, and occasionally nolition. We'll see all those terms again. Reply to objection 2 really just rounds out the discussion of powers and how opposites are contained under a proper object. So given that you are talking about the good, then sure, you consider all kinds of opposites. Given that you are talking about this plan or that plan, the plans all exist within the context of the proper object of the true. Whatever the object of the power is, the opposites come in under it. Medical science, as Aristotle uses in metaphysics, doesn't consider all conceivable opposites, but only those that are contained under the object of health, the opposite ways of bringing it about. And so the text here is relatively easy, but you should notice, I think, that we have question 6, article 3 on negation again. That negation article that we did early on in the series, very important. The will can be directed to such opposite purposes as are contained under good, such as to be moved or not moved, to speak or not speak, and such like. And then finally, the reply to the cheeky objector in objection 3, who brought up the convertibility thesis against Aquinas. That which is not a being in nature is considered as a being in the reason. Wherefore negations and privations are said to be beings of reason. And in this way, too, future things, insofar as they are apprehended, are beings of reason. Accordingly, insofar as such like are beings, they are apprehended under the aspect of good, and it is thus that the will is directed to them. Wherefore the philosopher says, to lack evil, which is a negation and therefore a being of reason, is considered as a good, because it's not an actual thing. This is important because it actually brings up another really famous feature of Aquinas, and that is the way he talks about being in 2 broad senses. You can talk about beings as substances, things in the universe, things in re. And this is what he means by being in nature. Or things you think. Those beings of nature that exist in the reason. They exist as a thought. You might say now as a concept. A being of reason just means a thing that exists in your mind. As an abstraction, as a hypothetical, as a form that you've apprehended, as a thing you would like to do. We've actually looked at lots of beings of reason already in the earlier articles. We just didn't use the terminology. So a being of reason just means a thought, a thing that you think, an existing thing existing here, not out there in nature or in re. So if you remember the in intellectu in re stuff from Anselm's argument that we did in Form 3, then you get the basic idea here. So when we are viewing negations and abstractions on hypotheticals and futures and all those things that we've talked about already, they exist as beings here, and it's there, those things that have the aspect of the good. Again, we've seen this many times, but we actually saw it brought up almost explicitly in question 6, article 6, in fear. It's really just a slightly fancier way to discuss the way the form is apprehended, and that's the thing that we're wanting. And that's question 8, article 1. We didn't try to say too much. In fact, you should recognize that it's basically just a reset on question 6, but now we're oriented toward talking more about goods and about this next idea of end, which is what Article 2 is about. And from there, we can jump out into our future topics. So if you have any questions about the Article 1 video or anything else, you know how to get a hold of me. Drop a comment below, get a hold of me on Discord, etc. Otherwise, good studying, good luck, God bless.